Bro, welcome to the Try to Hit the Ball podcast. I'm here with Joseph Burgo, and we're going to talk a little bit about the psychology behind transgenderism, what we can do for young men, and much more. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Can you give me a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. I was trained as a psychoanalyst. I'm licensed as a clinical psychologist. I've been in private practice for like 45 years. I got into the gender space about 5 years ago. Well, I mean, my own daughter was impacted, and I decided to get involved on a professional level about 5 years ago and started doing research. And then I joined the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association and started working with trans-identified teens. And then it's sort of grown from there. I've been involved in different organizations. Right now, I'm mostly focused on adolescent boys who are trans-identified, detransitioners, mostly gay men who have detransitioned following surgery, and a number of men who are struggling with autogynephilia. So that's about a third each
And
of those.
do you see, I guess it's a good time to ask, do you see those three as three different groups, or what's your kind of opinion on that?
I do. I see them as really different groups. I mean, the teenage boys, I've done a lot of work with the parents involved at rogdboys.com, that website. I've done lots of interviews with parents. I've written about it for Reality's Last Stand. I think they're an unusual and a novel cohort, kind of the way ROGD girls are, like Lisa Lippman identified. They have different characteristics, but I think there's some similarities in the novelty of this group. And then there's the other two, which I think are more classically identified, trans-identified males, the homosexual, transsexual, very feminine boys who are homosexual in orientation, and then the autogynephiles who are heterosexual in orientation and have it's a different thing altogether. So to me, they're very different.
So for people who don't know, ROGD is a rapid onset gender dysphoria. And because a lot of people seem to put forward the idea that it doesn't apply to boys, what do you think of that notion?
I think that's wrong. I think it does apply to boys, in this sense, in that they're boys who, most of these boys showed no gender nonconformity their whole life. They weren't into girls' toys. They were stereotypically boy interests, kind of nerdy, kind of techie. A lot of them are highly gifted. Some are on the spectrum. They're the sorts of boys who never really fit in, but they didn't fit in for different reasons, not because they were gender nonconforming, just because they were odd, socially awkward, and they were kind of outside the male hierarchy group, just the way feminine boys are, but for different reasons. They're outsiders, often feel themselves to be kind of losers, you know.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what I guess we could ask is what do you think the current issues with the way that transgenderism and gender dysphoria is viewed are?
I think it's a really confusing time because there's so many different explanations for why gender dysphoria is on the rise. I have some very particular ideas about the boys and why we're seeing it more in boys than we have before, why we don't talk about it as much. I do think it's a kind of social contagion. I do think it's because ideas about gender ideology are available now that weren't available before. And they're broadly disseminated in schools everywhere. Kids are inundated with it on social media. So I think Lisa Lippman was good on that score. In explaining how social media has given rise to these new gender identities. So I do think it's a social contagion. For the boys, I think it's also has to do with growing up in a culture that in my view, is kind of misandrist, doesn't like men very much, views masculinity as basically synonymous with toxic masculinity, doesn't see men doesn't see masculinity as having any positive qualities really, and teaches men and boys that they should be more like women. So, yeah, I think that there's a big incentive to identify out of being a male today, especially if you already feel like you don't fit in. You know,
Mm.
like if you're a feminine boy or you're, you know, a nerdy, geeky type who just feels like a loser. There's a lot of reason to identify out of being a male. I mean, who wants to be the bad guy, first of all, right?
Yeah.
And, and if you don't feel that you fit in with that group, um, then you can identify with the female group and find a place there. So you get to belong. You get to feel, especially these days, you get to be, you know, feel like you're heroic and brave by coming out as trans. There's all sorts of benefit, right? And you know, it's interesting because pretty much every teenage boy that fits the description that I've seen is a gamer.
Mm.
They love that space. I think because my opinion is because it allows them access to like male groups and male team type activities that they didn't really get to experience, you know, in their IRL. You know that, you know, I think boys need boy only spaces, and they really thrive when they can be on teams with other boys, even whether it's gaming or in real life.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's so what can you explain what the two component theory is? Because it gets thrown around a lot, and I feel like people don't really understand it. So for the because obviously you don't subscribe to it because we mentioned ROGD, but for people who are new to this and don't understand, what is Blanchard's two component theory?
Well, he's talking about um, autogynephilia in particular, right? So, for if there's anybody left who doesn't know what autogynephilia is after White Lotus, um, it's a man's propensity to be sexually aroused by the image or idea of himself as a woman,
Mhm.
and that's been around for a long time. Blanchard has been documenting it, you know, for decades. Um, those men don't necessarily have gender dysphoria. You know, they might feel just aroused by that and they might get off on cross-dressing, but they don't want to become women. And
Mhm.
then, you know, the second component is it can develop, these men who are deeply into this fantasy can develop a kind of gender dysphoria and then believe that they are women trapped in men's bodies and try and live out their fantasy. So there's those two parts.
Mhm. So in your opinion, the causes for gender dysphoria are basically individual, and a psychologist would need to do a one-on-one session to understand why someone has it. It's not as simple as putting someone into two boxes. Is that
Uh,
right? Or,
totally, totally. Um, I mean, I see themes in the groups that I work with, but everybody's story is different, right?
Hmm.
The the autogynephiles, all of the men that I've consulted with or seen in therapy, it's been a very similar profile. Um, and you know, everybody knows that J. Michael Bailey and Ray Blanchard hold a very different view. They just think it's innate and you're born this way. But the men that I've seen are really they see being feminine as a refuge from the stresses of masculinity. That they're, you know, one of the things that I do in my work with these men is I help them see the patterns is when the autogynephilic fantasies become strongest, and it's always a case where the more stressful their life gets, or the more challenged they feel in their sense of their masculinity, the stronger becomes the fantasy to escape from it. So there's that theme, but it's, you know, kind of shows up in every one of these guys in different ways. It's just a theme that I look for, but I do think that there is this view of womanhood in autogynephiles as being somehow less stressful, easier than being a man.
Mhm.
Uh, I think I mentioned to you that I saw this. One of the trans rights activists put up a picture on X. And the caption said, "It was too hard being a man, so I became a woman."
I see that. I see that as well with my interviews with the trans maxers, where people, who aren't that say, "Oh, I couldn't get a girlfriend, so I became a girlfriend," and these themes seem to run throughout it.
Yeah, it's and that this idea is not new. It's not like I invented or came up with this idea. Amy Bloom wrote an article for I think for the New Yorker. I don't know. It was like 30, 40 years ago. It's a great article called "Conservative Men in Conservative Dresses," um,
Mm,
about going on a cruise with a group of cross-dressers and their wives. And one of the men in there says, you women really know how to kick back and just relax. And her whole view of these men is that they see um, cross-dressing as a kind of respite from masculinity, as a relief, a mode of relaxation. I see it. I see
mm.
it in all the guys that I work with.
Yeah, it seems like a kind of a theme throughout it. So, what we've already kind of covered that. What are your views on the causes of gender dysphoria?
Well, I think they're different for the different groups that we've talked about, but I think on some level they're all driven by shame. And when you feel really bad about yourself, when you feel that you're defective or damaged or you're a loser or you're never going to fit in or you're never going to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, um, the narcissistic response is to create a new self, right? That's my 2015 book, The Narcissist You Know, talks a lot about this, that the way to cope with shame is to create a new self, an idealized new self, and to repress or abandon all the shame-ridden sense of self that you've been living with your whole life to become somebody new. I think that's what trans ideology offers, is
Mm,
you can just become somebody new. And you see it in the way they, like this whole dead naming thing, is that you've killed off the former identity, which I consider the shame-ridden identity. You've gotten rid of it and you've become somebody new. And then you get all of this praise and admiration again for being brave, and courageous, to come out publicly. I mean, it's a huge draw. I mean, if you feel like you're damaged goods or you're a loser, I mean, I see the appeal, you
yeah,
know.
I mean that hits quite heavy what you just said. When you say narcissist, though, so for people who don't, for layman's, you don't mean in like the negative sense. You just mean kind of something that everyone has innately, in that they want to see themselves in a better way. Is that right?
Well, I mean, narcissism's a spectrum, like, for sure. But the narcissism in a kind of pathological sense, where it's not just about self-esteem, but it's about hiding from yourself and deceiving other people as to who you really are. I'm talking about the latter,
Mhm,
more pathological kind of narcissism. I mean, to reject yourself, um, because you feel you're too damaged or shame-ridden, and to become somebody new is a really unhealthy,
mhm.
way to cope with shame.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's that hits quite heavy what you just said with my experience actually, with the whole wanting to be someone who knew and creating a new person was kind of what I was doing in the time that I was doing it. Um,
Well, and
so
it's just the adult. It's also like sort of like the epitome of adolescence in a way. It's like we're all trying to come up with who we are and to create this identity. And the idea that you can just start over and be somebody new, different from the loser kid you grew up with, all the way through, elementary and middle school, and just become somebody new. Wow, it's intoxicating.
mm, yeah, yeah, I I can attest with like that was kind of how I felt when I was thinking about doing it myself. Um, so how how often do you think that gender dysphoria as a whole is misdiagnosed due to the fact that it's kind of purely subjective as a feeling? Or do you think that because I guess how I'm trying to express that is how would one be sure one is experiencing gender dysphoria when it's something purely internal?
I think that the diagnosis gender dysphoria is like way, way overused. Um, And I'm not sure how useful it really is, because it comes along with the whole ideology that says one can be born in the wrong body. And that's definitely not helpful. And I think that gender dysphoria often just means, you don't like yourself very much, and you're explaining it with reference to your gender.
Mhm.
You know, it's that's just an explanation. I mean, usually when I work with trans identified teens and try and drill down into what it is, that they don't have very clear ideas about it. They just feel, yeah, I just don't feel comfortable in my skin. Well, I don't feel comfortable in my skin is the way most teenagers feel. And it's a stage we all go through in the process of developing an identity. So I don't know, gender dysphoria has become this catch-all for a lot of different kinds of identity crises, I think.
Because it also says, like, I mean, the diagnosis of it, like, I think the official diagnosis says that it's not inherent to being transgender, which really confused me, because it's like, well, then what is it? If it's not inherent to being anything, then what is gender? What does it even mean?
I can't explain it to you, Sasha, because none of it makes sense to me either.
Okay, no, fair enough. It's trying to get your head around the theories and things like that is like a bit of it's mental gymnastics.
Well,
Um,
they're word games, they're just, and they're diagnostic criteria devised by people who are trying to prove something. They're trying to come up with a theory that will allow them access to the medical treatments they want.
mm,
So I don't know how scientifically based any of it is. I think not much.
Because I mean, even the Blanchard's theory that people look at as if it's based in observable facts. I watched an interview with him the other day, and he has a different definition of what paraphilia means to everyone else. So it's like, okay, so if we work with his definition, then suddenly his theory makes sense. But you have to pull back and change your definitions of words a lot of times for these gender identity or any of the gender theories to make sense when you look at who originated them.
Do you remember what his definition of paraphilia?
He said that he leans more towards the idea that it's any sexual anything that doesn't involve reproduction, and he used the word leans because he wanted to be obviously careful in the way he said it, but he basically leans towards the idea that at least in this interview from what he said is that homosexuality would be a form of paraphilia.
Because it doesn't lead to reproduction.
Yeah, which is like okay. But it's like, okay, if we're just inventing new words for everything, then I guess nothing means anything. Yeah.
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 Well, there's a lot of that going around in this space of just inventing words or inventing definitions. It's like the one that really gets me is erotic target error locate. What is it? Erotic target location error.
Mm.
And this is a scientific term that's widely accepted as explanatory. And I don't know, it's tautological to me. It's just saying this thing is when you make a mistake in identifying, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's just coming up with some scientific sounding language to make it seem like you understand what's going on when you don't really. I mean, my whole problem with the Mike Bailey group is it's basically autogynephilia just is.
Yeah.
That's their whole point of view, right?
Yeah. It's the same as gender identity when you really break it down. It's just like it is because I said it is, and then anytime someone contradicts me, they're a liar. It's
Well,
like it's you can't because I come from like a kind of technical background, so I'm trying to understand these theories the way you would a mathematical one in a sense, and then it's like you can't just base everything on self-reporting and then say when someone says something counter to your self-reported data from a self-report that self-report is a lie. Like that's not good mythology.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to give that group their due, they have a huge amount of data, and these are data scientists, right? These are data-driven scientists, and so they have access to, thousands of people. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm interested in the psychodynamic roots of disorders, and I have access to like a dozen people. So I can't compete with them, especially since Bailey's attitude towards psychoanalysis is contempt. You know,
Mhm.
he thinks it's not useful for understanding or explaining anything. So he just dismisses my profession out of hand and my work as being invalid because it's not science. Well, it isn't science in his sense of the word. I
But
don't
then
have
neither is really his end, because as far as I can tell, they're not measuring brains. So and even if they were, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it was environmental in any case. Like, because unless you have a human in a sterile environment for their entire life, there's literally no way of doing this in a pure science way.
totally, totally.
Mm.
You know, it's too bad. I wish he were more interested in the psychodynamic aspects of it. But he just doesn't, he has no time for it, none whatsoever.
So his view, their view is that this is a kind of innate thing that people are born with. Is that right?
Right. You're
Okay.
born for sure. And, you know, the thing that I think is really good about what they're doing is they're trying to raise awareness that autogynephilia is a real thing and don't transition,
Mm.
because it doesn't mean you were born in the wrong body. It means you've got this paraphilia that maybe you were born with. You've got this unusual sexual orientation. Know that about yourself and don't medicalize. I think that's a really good thing. I'm glad they're doing that.
Yeah. No. I agree with that. I think that their ruthless endeavor to put everyone into two boxes is what worries me a little bit.
Right.
But I do think I do agree with that though. I think that makes a lot of sense. Because correct me if I'm wrong though, but Blanchard originally thought that transitioning also gynephiles was the right thing to do, right? Or is that wrong?
I think for some,
Mm.
yeah.
Hmm. No, I don't want to. But yeah, I think he. Okay, so how do you? That leads me to the next thing. How do you think it forms if it's psychodynamic? Gender dysphoria in general.
Gender dysphoria in general.
Mm.
Um, Well, I think the population we're talking about across all three types that we've discussed is this basis in some sense of shame or damage that you're defective. Um, you know, you feel like a loser, basically. I wrote an essay a few years ago called "The Failed Boy," which is what I see in a lot of the boys, that they just feel like they just failed as boys. They didn't measure up in any way to boy standards. I think I think it's probably the same with a lot of the girls in the ROGD group, that they feel like failures. They
Mm.
feel like they're outsiders. They tend to be kind of quirky. A lot of them are on the spectrum. So I think you have all of these feelings of shame and damage that have been around for a while. I mean, boys have been outsiders for, forever. Girls have not fit in forever. People who are on the spectrum have been bullied and teased forever. But what's different now is that we have a new explanation for all of that.
Mm.
We now that's the gender ideology just came along, and it now offers this alternative explanation, which is all of that can be accounted for by the fact that you're trans. And it can all be repaired by you embracing your transness and coming out. That that's the new solution that came around, what, about 15 years ago,
Mm.
maybe even more recently. Um, but so I think it's a disparate group of people who are all struggling with shame on some level, who are offered a one size fits all solution. You're trans.
That makes sense. Um, so what do you think? I guess you've kind of already answered this, but what do you think both people most get wrong about gender dysphoria?
Well, thinking that it's one thing to begin with. That when people say they have gender dysphoria, they know what they mean, and that it's actually about their sexed body. I think that's not all. I think that's rarely the case, actually. I think it's some other sense of discomfort in your skin, feeling like you don't belong, which you can then, especially if it's in the media, especially if it's around you all the time, you can then start attaching to your body, and you can locate it, and you can then start believing, oh, I feel uncomfortable because I have a developing female body. That could be for a lot of reasons. I think it's uncomfortable for young women to come of age and to become sex objects all of a sudden. I think that's hugely uncomfortable, and especially in our sexualized culture, it's scary. And if you have been exposed to hardcore porn and you have imagery of sex that's scary and violent, why would you want to be a woman?
Mm.
You know, I think there's different reasons why people want to opt out of their gender, but I don't think it's about this mismatch between your sense of self and the body you were born in. I think it's sociological, it's psychological, and it just gets lumped in and labeled this one thing.
Where does, because we spoke about Blanchard's theory, and that has a really obvious root, but where does gender identity actually come from, the theory? Or who?
Well, it's got a long history. I mean, the idea of gender as distinct from sex really that's alone is fairly recent, and you can trace that to Simone de Beauvoir originally, where she says you're not born a woman, you become one.
Mm-hmm.
And her point was that femininity is a set of societal role expectations, and that's distinct from being a biological female, and that you don't have to conform to those. And then through the work of Stoller and some other people in the 60s, they started coming up with this idea that you could have a gender identity. And that was a really new idea. That's a novel idea. Gender identity before was confined to, developmental theories where you came to the awareness of your gender. You recognize, oh, I'm a boy,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a girl, and you were able to make that class distinction. But then this new thing came about, and there's a number of people who were involved, but Stoller is one of the big ones, where they came up with this idea of gender identity, and then from there you could be born with a mismatch between your gender identity and your sexed body. So it's pretty new. It's really since the 60s.
So it's kind of it's kind of an evolved philosophy rather than an actual theory.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and the people who will argue with you will say, "Oh, that's not true. There's third sexes in all these different cultures," which is true. There are these third categories, but they never lost sight of the fact that the people in those categories, particularly men, were actually men.
Mm.
And they were living out the female role. And that was usually a way to defend classical ideas of masculinity. They wanted to separate out those feminine men from the male group and regard them as some kind of other. So it's not like these other cultures actually recognized a third sex that was reality biologically based. They just made room for these people who didn't conform within their cultures.
Yeah. So what do you think we can do to help young men, the $1 million question, to help young men growing up today?
It's a really hard question to answer because it involves macro changes on a societal level. Richard Reeves has a really good book that came out a couple of years ago called Of Men and Boys. And he's talking about some of the structural changes that we can make, like boys should start school a year later than girls because they developmentally lag girls, and that will help them do better in school and feel better about themselves later on. We need to encourage men to get more involved in health, education, administration, literacy, teaching, more roles that are associated with women typically. Those are you really worthy recommendations, but how do you change a culture that has come to view men as bad? I mean, I do think that the Trump's election is in part accounted for by a reaction by a lot of men against the sort of man shaming that's been going on for decades now.
Yep.
I don't know how we change that. Um, I'm right now. I'm working. I'm working on a paper called "We're Not Helping Boys Get Through Puberty," and I've been looking at like or like hunter-gatherer cultures and less evolved civilizations, and they all have these rituals and rites that helped boys make the transition from boy to man. And you can talk about them as primitive, but the point is they were designed to help boys transition into manhood and to integrate them into the hierarchy of the tribal structures and to solidify their identity as men. Well, we don't have anything like that anymore.
Yeah.
And in fact, all boy groups are increasingly, frowned upon. Um, I mean, like the whole Gamergate thing,
Yeah.
and gaming as a male thing. But you know, Boy Scouts. I'm writing about the Boy Scouts in the part I'm writing right now. Um, Boy Scouts. I don't know if you know this, but Boy Scouts of America is no longer Boy Scouts of America. It's Scouting America, and it's boys and girls now.
Hmm.
And it's now recently come out as being trans inclusive.
Ah,
So, so I don't know what there is for boys anymore, where boys just get to be boys and bond with one another and deal with all the boy issues that have to do with sorting things out at puberty. I don't know how do we
I think as well, a lot of people will be like, well, what's wrong with that? And I think they don't take the quite obvious view that it's like, well, there are no spaces just for boys anymore, but there seems to be very much spaces which girls are pushed into, or they're pushed into all of the boys' spaces, and boys don't. I was trying to compile a list the other day of things that, as wider society, we celebrate boys for doing, and like for aspiring to and achieving. And I literally got about stockbroker and American football player. And that's pretty much the only two I can think of that, like, as a society, aren't being requested that girls, could do a better job at, or why aren't there more girls in? Um, and it's kind of stark that there's not really many decisions, and not many people want to grow up to be a stockbroker or an American football player, or not many people will be, because it's very high stress jobs. So it's
Right.
only at the peak of stress and status, in a sense, that we're still allowing men to achieve. Anyone who's kind of falling in the middle ground, it's very much get more girls in. There aren't enough women in these fields.
Yeah, and Richard Reeves talks about that a lot. There's kind of a zero-sum view of initiatives for men and women, so that anytime you talk about trying to have a program that would benefit men, like let's try and get more men into this area, they immediately take it as that, meaning there'll be less for women.
Hmm.
But you can't encourage both. You can encourage women, but you can't also encourage men. Even though all the statistics show that women are outperforming men kind of everywhere these days.
Yeah.
Um, but there's still scholarships and all sorts of programs to get women into college and into certain professions. There's hardly anything for men.
Yeah, it feels like we're trying to fix the problems of the past, which aren't necessarily even problems anymore, and we keep pushing the window further and further until it's going to be. I don't know, like you said, I don't know if people will ever see that it's too late. I think we're in this kind of cycle where it feels like we're just going to keep going, and then at some point people might look back and go, "Oh, that was a mistake," but it will be way down the line.
Well, I've been joking for a long time. Is that like what we need is a land invasion in our country, you know? So then people will see what's the value of men,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I mean, it's awful to say, but I mean, that's one of the things that could, a lot of this kind of introspection that's going on amongst men, that could definitely fix it, is giving some sort of, outside enemy to think about.
Evolution wise, that's what men were designed to do, right? I mean, evolution shaped us to be aggressive and competitive in the sex selection process, and then to use our larger bodies and greater strength and our aggression in the service of defending the tribe against other tribes, right? That was our purpose.
Mm,
And now all of those things are bad. Being aggressive is bad. Being competitive is bad. We just shame, the biologically driven aspects of masculinity that we can't help, you
mm.
know. we're just made the way we are. But the we just shame men for being the way they are and tell them they need to be more like women.
Yeah.
We need to
Yeah,
stop it.
I agree. I think that's a good way of so what are you working on now? You said it a bit, but what are you working on at the moment?
Well, this paper that I'm working on about boys in puberty, I got started when I was thinking about this fact that there aren't any rites of passage for boys anymore. I mean, what marks? I mean, if you're a Jewish boy, you have a bar mitzvah,
Mm.
right? And that's marks you as a man. But what else? What else do we have? We don't have anything. So then I started looking at books about puberty written for boys and or parents of boys. And what I found was they pretty much are they've all adopted a blank slate view of human nature. And that there's really nothing in these books that's geared towards boys, explaining to them about why they're more aggressive, why they think about sex so much, why they're so competitive, why they get angry, and then teaching them, helping them find ways to channel that somewhere. I mean, that's what we used to do, right? I think, that's what those rituals and rites were, is they were to help boys, channel all of that energy, that crazy energy at puberty that comes with testosterone, to channel into something productive and socially useful. Um, that was a good thing. We just don't do that anymore. So I don't know. I'm going to be hard pressed at the end of this article to come up with recommendations.
Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with at the end of my book as well. It's like I promise some positivity, and it's hard because it's such a macro problem.
I was so I got onto this topic about 7 years ago when I was trying to write a book about the good things about men. Because I felt, and I still feel like the good things about men are being overlooked in a culture that's always talking about toxic masculinity and Me Too and the patriarchy and rape culture on campus, all these bad things. So I was taking an evolutionary psych view about the traits that evolution instilled in men
Mm.
and showing the positive ways they can be expressed. Um, my agent sent it out, and I got 17 rejections that were very similar in nature. And they basically said that I'd failed to acknowledge that masculinity is 100% socially constructed, and we can shape it into whatever we wanted it to be. So
That's
I was wrong there. And the
that's
fact that
disturbing.
it was very disturbing. Well,
Mm.
New York publishing is totally captured, right?
Mm.
Um, and then the other complaint I got was that, because I was writing about biology and Evo Psych, that meant I was a biological essentialist, which is a really bad thing to be. I mean, biological
It's like
essential.
another made up word. What does that mean?
Well, it actually has a long history, and
Mhm.
it's got a deservedly bad name. Basically, it's a theory that's been used to repress women for
Mhm.
generations. That women are irrational. So therefore, they're not suited to positions of leadership or power. Women are physically weaker, which makes them by nature submissive.
Mhm.
Uh, their anatomy means they're designed to be mothers and they should stay at home. I mean, it's like arguing from biology in a really oppressive way. So,
Okay.
but the reaction against that, the understandable reaction against that means that now we can't talk about any differences.
Yeah, because
Um,
I mean, just because you're talking about the differences doesn't mean that you're inherently saying that those biological essentialism things are true. You're just saying that hey, there are these truths, but that doesn't mean that we have to react to them in a certain way or build society around them in a certain way, right?
Totally. I mean, yeah. I mean, the biological essentialists who were essentially misogynists were doing that. They're trying to say this is what's true, and therefore society needs to, conform to that. And what I'm saying is there are certain things that are true on average
Mm.
about men in ways that they're on average different from women, and we need to acknowledge those and figure out how, as a society, we can put those to good use. How
Yeah.
we can how we can channel aggression and competitiveness into, socially beneficial ends. That's what we used to do,
Yeah,
you
these
just,
things don't have to be a negative. Like these things don't have to be a net negative to everyone. Like the way that those people you're talking about would put forward, they can just be accepted as somewhat true, and then we can still have everyone be free and do what they want, and just we can have two things can be true. That's what I get so confused with. It feels like everyone's very one track minded with all of this stuff.
they're very one track minded, and they're very, oh, I don't even know what to write. They're very reactionary. You know the story about James Damore at Google?
Yeah.
You know, he just basically said, on average, men are more interested in things than people,
Mm.
and women are on average the reverse. And maybe that's one reason why there are more men in tech than there are women. And he got canceled and fired for saying that. I mean, it's just one of those very robust, often repeated findings. Men are more interested on average
Yeah.
in things than people. Why
Yeah.
can't we talk about that? But you're not allowed to even talk about it.
It's bizarre. It's really odd. Okay, so we'll come to our final question, which is something I'm asking everyone, which is if you could tell your younger self something, what would it be?
I would tell myself, don't feel so ashamed at being a failed man, because there are lots of ways of being a man, and that the important thing is to acquire some sort of mastery at something, and to put it to use and persevere until you're successful at it. And that will make you feel good about yourself as a man, even if you don't fit other gender stereotypes. I think that advice, that's the book I really want to write for boys and men who don't fit in, is like, there's all sorts of ways to feel good about yourself as a man, even if you don't fit gender stereotypes.
No, that's a very succinct answer, and that's pretty good. Okay, so it's where can people find you? Where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, mostly these days I write for Colin Wright's Substack, which is Reality's Last Stand. I've got hundreds of thousands of words on my website, which is afterpsychotherapy.com. I started writing that in 2012 and wrote, prolifically for years on it. I don't anymore write there, but I've just got a ton of stuff there. If you want to reach me personally, I'm at joeburgo.com. If you're interested in working with me, I take what people can afford these days. I don't have a set fee, and I just want to work with this cohort of the men and boys who are struggling. Yeah, I've got some books out there. They're on Amazon and in bookstores. You can find me.